All right, so picture this and tell me if this sounds familiar, right? You see this bike. It's all new, it's brand new. It's something completely different from, what's been on the market in the past, and it's got new standards with the bike industry. And it's something that you've been looking at and you've had your eye on it for a long time.
Oh, would you look at that? Just look at it.
All the reviews start to come in. You start to watch them. You're doing reading, you're researching, you're comparing to other bikes that you've had in the past. You're seeing what all the people online are saying, the influencers, the reviewers.
So dialed and
the benefits of a high pivot.
And then you're like, you know what? I'm going to do it. So you buy it. You build it up. You pick every part. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you just take from your other build and you transfer parts. You build a frame up. Or you buy a complete bike because the spec just seems right and that's the way it fits your budget. So you do it. You get it. It's everything that you dreamed of. And then you can't get used to it. Something about that bike is just off. Well, welcome back to the channel, everybody. On this video, this is a video I've been wanting to make for a while. And this video is not to bash any bike brand or any bike manufacturer or anything like that. This video is about my personal experience, which may be similar to yours, about a bike that I bought, a dream bike, that in the beginning, it blew me away with the differences between this bike and other bikes. And the differences are so big in some aspects. And then the differences in other aspects are just not what I wanted it to be.
I hate this freaking bike! This stupid bike!
As you know, the industry has been going, they get on a tangent and they go down this road every few years, trying to change it up, trying to innovate. And the latest fad has been high pivot mountain bikes, which is not anything new. It's just a reiteration of, the downhill scene back, 10, 15 years ago when they tried high pivot.
And now for something completely different.
Because it just makes sense, right? The pivot's high, hits a bump, the wheel gets out of the way, right? And that's supposed to get you more momentum and go faster. Well, that concept works. It really does. So the fad that's been going around is high pivot bikes. So when I saw this high pivot bike, I had to have it. The bike that I built up was a DV8 Claymore. And let me tell you, I had no reservations about this bike when I went into it. I was just like, yep, my sponsoring shop, the Wheelhouse, up in Claremont, New Hampshire, they carry, all these brands. They carry Transition, they carry Trek, they carry Revel, they carry Forbidden now. So they have multiple high pivot bikes to choose from. And when I approached them about wanting the Deviate, they were like, oh yeah, absolutely. Buy it, we'll build it up, we'll build any bike. So they did. So what happened? We broke up. We couldn't jive. We just had this relationship that, we wanted different things. And we just had to part ways. And not saying that it's a bad bike. It's an awesome bike. And that's the thing about these days, right? There's so many options to choose from. We can pick a bike that fits our own riding personality. And there's a bike out there, but you just got to find the right one. As a mountain biker that's been biking for close to 30 years, I know, it's been a long time. I'm old, right? I know what I want out of a bike, and I know what I want, and I know how I want it to react when I ride in certain situations, right? So in this video, I want to go over the few things that I just couldn't jive with, the few things that I just couldn't get over to cause me to not want this bike anymore. And then also, I want to go at the end of the video, reveal what I replaced it with and why. All right, let's get into it. First off, I'll go over, to say that I already made a review video about this bike, and I called it High Pivot Heaven. And I'll leave a link at the top. And it truly is. It goes straight line, faster than any bike I've ever ridden. I've shaved seconds, like 10 to 15 seconds off straight downhill, chunky tech trails with just riding this bike. You know what I mean? But I'll go over the few things and that I just couldn't jive with. And number one is the weight, right? Not a big deal, right? It's just a little bit heavier than your normal bike. You know, instead of a 7-pound all mountain or enduro frame, you're dealing with a 8, 9-pound. But the weight distribution is low, much like an e-bike where the motor would be down near the bottom bracket. Well, that causes for me, I do a lot of really steep, technical, tight, you know, mountain lines where I'm always, you know, pivoting on my front wheel, endo turning, using my front brake and everything else. And that made it difficult, all right? So that's not a big deal. But other frames and other manufacturers, you're going with this high pivot situation and they haven't worked out the kinks of the weight and everything else. And they haven't gotten as creative as Deviate with their linkage. You know, the linkage on the Deviate is an amazing piece of engineering. It's really, truly unique. The wishbone and the bearing that goes around the bottom bracket and extends underneath so it actually elongates your chainstay. So when you go down in the travel, it's extending that chainstay, getting the rear wheel out of the way and making you go in a straight line faster. But other manufacturers haven't gotten that creative, and some of their bike frames now are 10.5, 11 pounds for a carbon frame, right? So that's difficult for me. And that also makes the climbing that much harder. I want a bike that goes up just as good as it goes down. And these days we can have both. We can have a cake and eat it too, right? And then the second aspect that I just could not jive with, and it all stems around that chainstay growth. It grows about 11 millimeters in length when you go down into the travel. So when in these situations are you getting into that travel, right? You're going down and you're slapping a turn. You're going into a berm. You're compressing your G out into that corner or whatever, and you push out. Normally where you would have like a standard, you know, single pivot bike or something like that, depending on how you have it set up, you could push into the corner and you would shoot out of the corner. You know what I mean? But this almost had the sensation that you would push into the corner. You could feel, I could feel the wheelbase grow. And it almost has this sensation that the rear wheel has your low pressure on your tire. Almost has that like wobbly feel. Like we've all probably felt that, right? When our tire's going low, we're on a downhill run, we're going through berms, and all of a sudden we start feeling this squishy rear end, right? And that's what it feels like in certain situations. When you're really pushing hard and you're going into those berms and you're pushing into them, that's the sensation. It almost like your wheel's doing this behind you and it feels like you have a flat. Multiple times I've come down to the bottom of the trail and been like, no, I still have 30 PSI in my rear tire. It's not the tire, it's the linkage. Yes, everything's tight. It has that weird sensation. So I could not jive with that aspect. And it's New England. We corner all the time, pop out of pockets, all the time, trying to sprint out of corners and stuff like that. And that was the other thing. You lose speed in the corners, and then you can't get out of them, and you sprint, and it's not the most sprightly bike. And I haven't ridden a high pivot bike, honestly, that is very sprightly. It'll go down in a straight line faster than anything else, but as far as sprightly, I haven't heard anybody call a high pivot bike sprightly yet. And then comes number 3. So think of this, right? You're trying to, you really suck at manuals.
You suck, you jackass.
Just like me, okay? And you're trying to get better at them. And you have a bike that the chainstay grows 11 millimeters as you're trying to go down in this travel. Well, the sensation for that is it's a whole different animal where you've been used to manualing for a really long time. And you can do pretty good. You can manual for 10, 15 feet, no problem. Just boom, out of the blue. You see a rock, you see a stump, you see a down tree or something like that. You just pop it up and then just pop over the log or whatever. And it just is natural, right? Well, on this high pivot, it's a different sensation, right? And it's not a bad sensation. It's just different than what I'm used to. And you may like it. If you're a newer biker or something like that, you may not even notice. But me, having ridden so many bikes over my, riding career, I noticed just immediately. You go into a manual, especially if you're going, through a couple rollers, like on a pump track, you go through the first roller, you pump, and then all of a sudden, like, the chainstay grows, and that shortens really quick as you try to manual that up. And the front end comes up way faster than you had anticipated. And that is another sensation I just couldn't get used to. I just couldn't do it. And you know what? This may be nitpicking, but those are the few items that I just could not jive with this bike, to the point where I was frustrated. I didn't enjoy riding it a lot. It was, not the heaviest bike. It was like 35 pounds, having built it all up. It's a fast bike. It's a really good bike, but it just wasn't for me. So what did I replace it with? Well, if you've been watching the channel for a long time, I started out riding Yeti bikes. My favorite bike for riding around here was the SB150. It was perfect. Like, Yeti always seemed to be ahead of the game. They had a 150 mil bike with a 170 mil fork with a 64.5 degree head angle. And the recipe was just awesome. And that bike was one of the first that had all those angles to be on the market. And it was great. It pedaled great. It descended great. I won't talk about, how reliable the frames were or the carbon. But with that said, what did I replace it with? I rode that bike. And then for years, I rode a Trek Slash Gen 5, where same thing, very similar geo. Short chainstays, 437 chainstays, 64.5 degree head angle, 160 rear, 170 front. And that bike was great. But the only downside of that bike is it didn't pedal as good as the Yeti. It had a slacker seat tube angle. And, pedaling with that bike was also a little bit of a chore. So in my next bike, I just wanted a really sprightly, big enduro bike, super slack, but yet lightweight and nimble and poppy and fun and fast. Yeah, I know, I wanted it all. I did. So with all that being said, the Slash Gen 5 was one of my favorite bikes I'd ever owned. It was just so good in the mountains. It was nimble. It was pretty lightweight. It pedaled okay, but it was predictable. It was one of the most easy bikes to set up and just send somebody out with the factory settings, and it was just intuitive. You just got on it and you rode it and did everything well, right? So I was just looking for a Trek Slash Gen 5 with a little bit longer chainstays for more stability and a little bit more speed, and I was looking for a steeper seat tube angle and something that pedaled a little bit better with a better linkage, right? So long story short, all these years later comes the Transition Spire. I have never tried one before. It's been out for like 2 or 3 years, and it was on my radar briefly, but then the Deviate, high pivot, phase, and fad caught my eyes, and that's where I went for about a year. And I descended 200,000 feet and probably 1,000 miles on that Deviate. And before I realized that it wasn't for me. The Transition Spire was everything that I wanted the Gen 5 Slash to be. So as you can imagine, I didn't give the new Trek Slash that great of a review, right? Because I had this other bike in mind of what I wanted the new Trek Slash to be. But the Transition Spire had a steep seat angle. It had full 41 chainstays, or even full 45, don't quote me on it. Longer chainstays. You can put your hand between the rear tire and the seat stay, which is weird. It looks odd. If it's in front of you, you'll just be like, oh, wow, I didn't even notice that. It looks weird. But they call it the giddy up suspension, right? And it's a super slack bike. It's like 62.5, 63 degrees in high position. I was like, this is not going to ride good. It's going to be a beast, right? I got on that bike, and for the first time in a while, I'm like, this bike climbs better than the Yeti. It pedals better. It's more sprightly. But yet, when you get into the travel, it is a bruiser. And that's probably why they call it the Nimble Bruiser, right? Because it's one of those bikes that you can pedal up the hill, you go downhill, you can actually physically push, and it will shoot you out of the corner. And it'll shroud turns, it'll manual, it'll jump super well, it'll pop off stuff. It's like a 170 millimeter playful bike, which I never thought would be, like the bike I wanted, right? And it's fast too. I don't know how they did it and what kind of magic fairy dust they sprinkled on this bike, but it does everything that I wanted it to do, and it's amazing, right? And, these reviews are all subjective, right? You may get on the Transition Spire and be like, nah, nothing special. You may get on the Deviate and you may love it. Maybe the best thing that you've ever ridden. But we may just be completely different people with completely different riding styles, completely different interests, I'm not saying that I'm the norm because, I ride a lot of stuff that, a lot of people around here, they're like, that's not mountain biking. You carry your bike up for 2 or 3 hours up into a mountain and you ride down these hiking trails or these multi-use trails that nobody's even thought of biking. I mean, they've probably thought of it, and I'm not the first one to do it, but yeah, that's not the norm. People around here, they just like to pedal their cross-country technical mountain bike trails and, up, down, and around, up, down, and around, and they like getting that sweat on and get their workout on. And slowly we're turning the corner around here where people are getting more and more into enduro and, bike park style trails and stuff like that. But you know what? Somebody might get on a Deviate and that might be the bike for them. They're not up in the mountains doing these, endo turns around sharp corners, like trying to make it through this seemingly unrideable section that hikers look at you and they call you nuts. And, maybe I'm just not normal. Maybe that's it. But this bike blew me away. And just wait, on the channel, I'll have a full-blown review of the Transition Spire. I'll come up and I'll do a full review on it now that I've had some time to ride it. And I may actually even be building up another Transition because I am so stoked on my Spire. So with that said, hit that like, hit the subscribe button. And if you get any comments, let's talk about it down in the comments, right? I'm not going to say that, the Spire is the best bike or the Deviate's the best bike or, definitely don't buy either one of these bikes or don't buy the Trek or don't buy the Deviate or don't buy any of these bikes. I'm not going to say that, you know what I mean? Because we're all different. We all ride different. We all have different expectations of what we want out of our experience on the trails. And that is, first world problems for us right now because the biking scene is so good. There's so many good trails and there's so many good bikes. There is a bike for every person out there. So hit that like, hit the subscribe button. If you want to help support the channel, you appreciate this content, consider joining the Patreon down below, and we will see you on the next video. Thank you.